In 1907, there was a spot of Louisiana swamp the maps pretended not to know. Locals called it Black Briar Parish, 2 dirt roads, 1 creaking ferry, and a church bell that hadn't rung since the storm that split the steeple in half. People here lived by the river and the river's mood, and the river is generous to those who listen and cruel to those who don't. This is not a ghost story. It's worse. It's what happens when a town grows so isolated it invents its own rules, then rebrands its sins as tradition. 22 families disappeared between the cane fields and the cypress knees. Wagons were found with wheels sunk like tired bones. Horses cut loose. Pots still warm. No bodies. No answers. Just a rumor the wind carried down the water. In Black Briar, folks don't bury their dead. They eat their problems. What I'm about to tell you is one of the most disturbing cases I've ever dug into. How hunger became business, how business became religion, and how a sheriff who asked the wrong question was taught never to speak again. If you're new here, subscribe. I have more true stories coming that history tried to drown. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments, because there's a good chance your town keeps a story like this under floorboards too. The first family to vanish were the Russells. June heat, rasping cicadas, and a road the color of old tea. Their wagon turned up by the trestle bridge with a sack of flour split like a snowdrift across the planks. You could still see the tracks where someone small had swung their legs off the backboard. No struggle. No blood. Just absence shaped like 5 people. Sheriff Alton Reed walked the length of that bridge 9 times, jaw set hard, hat low. He wrote in his report, no footprints. No drag marks. River quiet. Smell of wood smoke from town. That last note will matter later. Black Briar had a butcher who wore a white apron that was never white after noon. Dew plancher. Thick wrists. Nails clean as a surgeon. He cut meat the way a pianist plays a favorite song, eyes closed, counting. Folks swore he could tell an animal's age by the weight of the haunch in his hand. He kept a leather ledger behind the counter. Dates, initials, pounds. It looked normal, until a schoolteacher named Eliza Carden noticed the page margins. Notations in a second hand, tiny and neat, no tendon, soft grain, lined the bones. Eliza taught in the one-room schoolhouse where the roof leaked in 2 polite places. She'd come from Shreveport on a dare to herself and stayed because the children brought her tadpoles in jelly jars and called thunder God-rolling barrels. She used the ledger's back pages to practice her French when Duplancher wasn't looking. The day the Russells vanished, she saw a line added in new ink. RL 5. Too small. Ledger of the lost. She didn't know what it meant. Not yet. There was also Father Silas Merrick, the parish priest with hands like kindling and a voice that could hush a room faster than rain. He tried to ring the cracked bell again after the storm. It stuck at the throat of the hour and never came down. Father Silas started walking house to house with a prayer book under one arm and a coil of questions under the other. He noticed the way supper smoke thickened on certain nights and thinned on others, how doors opened too fast or too slow, how children stared too long at his collar like it was a trick they were trying to solve. Sheriff Reed and Father Silas were an unlikely pair, law and faith, each suspicious of the other's tools. But the river forced them into the same boat, literally, when the ferry operator went missing on a Thursday and the ferry kept crossing anyway. No pilot. Just a rope and the current and the sense that the parish had put itself on a schedule. By August, 4 more families were gone. The Baptistes left washing on the line like surrender flags. The Picard's rooster crowed under an empty window for 3 days. A baby's rattle turned up in a ditch, the beans inside swollen with rain. Sheriff Reed stood at the edge of town with his deputies and said, "No one travels alone. Not to the fields. Not to the river. Not to the privy. You hear me?" Men nodded. Women pulled their children close as if fear had a draft. Black Briar nodded back and did as it always did, smiled with its mouth, kept its secrets in its teeth. There were 2 places the town gathered when it pretended to be honest, the church and the Mercury, a general store that sold patent tonics promising to cure female nerves, and boots that never fit the same pair of feet twice. Eliza noticed the mercury had taken to keeping flour sacks near the door, easy to lift, easy to load. She also noticed a scale had been moved from behind the counter to the back room. When she stepped close to measure paper for a classroom chart, she saw a chalk tally on the wall, slashes grouped in 5s. 22 marks. A child's height from the floor. You'll ask, why not run? Some did. But a town isn't a place, it's a habit. And the habit of Black Briar was to weather everything with your neck bent like a reed and your mouth shut like a grave. Then, a letter came, the kind that smells like river and old pennies. Father Silas found it wedged in the church door at dawn, the paper puckered from damp. Inside, a single child's shoe, a scrap of red ribbon, and a page torn from a ledger. On the page, columns of weights, ages, and a final word repeated like a benediction, render. At the bottom, in a stiff slant, ledger of the lost. Ask Duplancher. Silas walked the note to Sheriff Reed. Reed read it twice, then a third time, and the color left him in stages. This doesn't leave this room, he said. Not yet. He slid the shoe back into the envelope like you slide a photograph back into a casket. If I'm wrong, I don't want to wreck a man's life. If I'm right, we are standing on a floor that isn't wood. That night the sheriff posted 2 men behind the butcher shop. He sat in his office with the lamp turned low and the door unlocked, like a man waiting to be convinced. The rain came in soft like a rumor. After midnight, a wagon rolled past, top tight, no lantern. The deputies shifted. The wagon didn't stop at the shop. It turned behind the Mercury, disappeared into the alley where the old ice house used to breathe its cold. When the deputies rounded the corner, the alley was empty. No tracks, no ruts, just the smell of smoke, and something sweeter that made their mouths water and their stomachs turn. The next morning the sheriff missed his breakfast appointment with Father Silas. He missed his noon rounds. By 3 o'clock, the bell in the broken steeple rang once. No wind, no hand. People gathered because that's what people do when something inside them says, listen. They found Sheriff Reed seated at his desk, hat on the peg, badge shining. A folded paper lay under his hand. The coroner would rule it natural causes because it's safer to call some things natural. The folded paper had 5 words in a tidy line. Ledger of the lost. Forgive me. Black Briar closed its doors for an hour out of respect, then opened again because business is how you keep from thinking. Father Silas looked at the paper, at the man, at the shadows that clung to the window corners like mold. He didn't cry. He said, no more bells. We start without them. We're going to start where Sheriff Reed left off, with the ledger, with the alley, with the weight marks at child height on the Mercury's wall. We'll meet the woman who kept the town fed and the men who pretended not to know what was on their plates. We'll follow the ferry rope to the island no map will admit. We'll open a locked room that has been waiting, patient as hunger. Eliza Carden kept the sheriff's paper and the child's shoe in a biscuit tin under her bed. She read the 5 words before sleep, after prayers, and again when the rooster took his first breath of morning. Ledger of the lost. Forgive me. She wondered which part asked for forgiveness, the ledger, the loss, or the writing itself. At dusk she walked past Duplancher's shop with a basket of chalk and slates as if headed for the schoolhouse. The butcher had closed early. The sign in the window said gone to supper in a hand too careful for a man who lived by knives. She tried the back door. Unlocked. A bell above it had been stuffed with cotton to keep from ringing. Inside, the room smelled of salt and smoke, and something like pennies on the tongue. The ledger sat where it always sat, behind the counter, against the wall, shadowed by a row of cleavers that made a hymn in steel. Eliza lifted it, heavy as a baby, and as full of names. She turned to the June pages. RL 5. Too small. Then July. BP 4. August PC 3. And along the margin, in the tiny second hand she'd noticed weeks ago, the same word, repeated, render. A moth battered the window like it wanted to be aflame. Eliza traced the column of weights with her finger and saw a pattern inside the numbers. Round totals, neat divisions, the math of a man who counted more than coin. She turned to the back where a pocket had been glued to the inside cover. It held slips of paper trimmed true and labelled like book chapters. Shore Road, a Ferrier Sunday. She slid out Sunday and read, close the gates. Bell at 1. Way at dusk. Lime at night. She put the slip back and felt the floor give under her heel. Not a loose board, give. She knelt, pushed aside a sack of salt stamped with a blue anchor, and found an iron ring fixed to a plank. She pulled. The board lifted like a tongue. Cold air washed up the smell of smoke and lard. Steps dropped into a dark belly. Somewhere below, morning broke brittle, bright, a crust of frost on the cane that cracked when you breathed too hard. Riverbend stretched, shook out its linen, and decided to pretend it had never done a thing wrong. Men raked gravel until it gleamed. Girls strung white flowers along the porch rail like a promise. In the kitchen, heat woke first, then sound, then the knowledge that once the first door swings there's no stopping a day like this. Celia set the stations like altars. Fish here, fowl there, pastry by the window where the light helps your hands, saucers at the back where only she would touch them. She laid out the knives the way a preacher lays out verses he trusts. Each had a job. None of them had an opinion. The menu read like a confession written to please the confessor. Oysters cold enough to make your teeth remember winter, a soup that wore its sherry like a secret, meats lacquered to mirror the candles, sides that hummed along without demanding their own applause. For dessert, a velvet thing that softened as you looked at it, sweet enough to silence a table. Pearl floated through once in her lace, a spill of white in a room that eats mess for breakfast. Celia, she breathed. It's all so. She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Celia answered with the one curtsy she'd kept since girlhood and let the bride's perfume go past like a friendly ghost. The groomspeople arrived in a parade of good coats and better opinions. Colonel Caldwell stood at the top of the steps and lent his smile to anyone who could afford to pass by it. Asher checked his cuff and practiced the face men wear when they want to look like they deserve what they're about to take. Celia's girls moved in time. Bread went to table just before its pride cooled. Wine found hands that trembled to be seen holding it. Celia tasted everything that mattered and nothing that did not. In a small pot at the edge of the stove, milk warmed low with vanilla and sugar and the kind of comfort even a bad house will allow to be pure. She poured it into 3 bowls, stirred until the steam smelled like a memory you'd volunteer to repeat, and sent it upstairs with a whisper, sleep now. Missed the worst of us. She tied her apron tighter, retied the string where the pantry key lived, and stood still long enough to feel her pulse settle into the day's rhythm. Then she lifted the first ladle, and the feast began to invent itself. The dining room loved applause. It had practice. Silver boasted under candlelight. Crystal held its breath like it had rehearsed for this exact evening. Toasts cleared their throats. The Reverend said grace in a voice that tried to sound like God and landed closer to a theater balcony. Pearl glowed like one of those fragile things rich people buy so they can feel careful. The groom looked at her like a man who has only ever counted his winnings. Oysters went first, briny enough to make the river feel invited. Praise climbed the walls. Rosalind dabbed at her eyes with a monogram square and whispered, "Perfect, Celia," in the direction of the kitchen as if gratitude was something you could throw and expect to hit right. Celia watched the room the way a clock watches a room, calm, relentless. She adjusted the timing without appearing to move. She sent the soup when the noise needed warmth, when voices had begun to jostle, when chairs had the restless look of legs about to be rude. At the head of the table, the colonel lifted his spoon, tasted the sherry like a man allowing a lesser thing to impress him, and nodded once, enough to be seen, not enough to be felt. Asher took seconds of everything, because Asher believed excess was a character trait. He had started to sweat at the temples, just a pearl or two making an argument his mouth hadn't approved. He laughed bigger to drown the treachery of his own skin. Celia plated the mains with a grace that did not ask to be named. Slices clean, glaze shining, a sprig here, a sprinkle there, the small dishonesties that make beauty look like effort. She served the colonel a portion that would please his pride and slow his hands. Rosalind's was prettier, gentler, a sweetness that would not offend a nervous stomach. And then there were the Thompsons and the cousins and the men who had learned to measure discipline in other people's bruises. Their plates found them, and they found their plates, and for a long, satisfying minute the only sound in the room was cutlery admitting what it was built to do. From the doorway, Celia met Asher's gaze. Across flowers and glass and the theatre of respectable laughter, a wire tightened and hummed. He raised his glass to her like a dare. She raised her chin a fraction, the way you do when a storm swallows thunder and leaves the lightning for later. In the kitchen, she closed her hand around the pantry key, felt the cold bite her lifeline, and breathed once, long, to steady tomorrow. The first slip came like a misplayed note. Colonel Thompson, guest of honor by wealth if not by heart, paused mid-sentence and frowned into his plate as if the food had insulted him. He dabbed his lips, tried again, found his words had grown teeth. A cousin rose to fetch water and discovered his legs preferred negotiation to obedience. Rosalind touched the hollow of her throat and whispered the name of a doctor 2 counties over. People do not panic all at once. They ease into it the way you ease into a cold river. Denial at the ankles, bargaining at the knees, prayer at the waist. Chairs scraped. Laughter tripped, recovered, tried to pretend it hadn't fallen. Someone opened a window that had always been ornamental. Winter shouldered in and nosed the candles until their confidence gutted. Asher stood as if summoned by the playbook of his own importance. The room's edges tilted a degree. He grabbed the back of his chair like a man steadying a drunk friend. "Easy," he said, to no one in particular, to everyone in general, to himself most of all. Then his fingers miscounted the wood. Celia did not rush. She signaled her girls with 2 fingers and a look they'd never seen on a living face. Water to the left. Quiet to the right. Doors open. No one run unless running was what you meant to do when you woke this morning. She walked to the window, felt the winter ask her to justify what she'd done, and gave it nothing. The Reverend began a prayer that didn't know its verbs. Rosalind tried to stand and found the floor ambition too high. The colonel's smile held 3 more seconds than it should have, then fell like a picture whose nail finally gave up. Celia stepped into the doorway and let her gaze pass through Asher as if he were already a memory. For a heartbeat, recognition bridged the room. His eyes widened, not with surprise, but with the offense a man feels when the world refuses to keep being convenient. His mouth opened to summon his father, or the law, or the old gods of entitlement. No sound. He swallowed, as if sound were food he could force down. Celia turned, not in triumph, not in haste, simply because there were other rooms that required her hands. In the scullery she poured a basin of water to wash anything that believed it mattered. She dried her fingers on the apron front, leaving no prints, and folded a small paper square she'd carried too long. She placed it where no one could miss it and no one could pretend to misunderstand. For Thomas, for Mary, for Eli. Celia Washington. She tied her bonnet under her chin like an ordinary woman done with an ordinary day's work and stepped into air that tasted like iron filings. Behind her, the house began to argue with itself in voices that walked the line between civility and pleading. The river listened without changing its mind. Morning found Riverbend as if it had wandered there by accident and didn't care for what it saw. The frost had come again, meaner, and the windows recorded the night in delicate white handwriting that said, "Someone broke a rule." The first to the dining room were not doctors or lawmen but appetite and habit. Then came grief, and it didn't stand on dignity. Chairs held bodies they no longer deserved. The table wore sudden history, spilled wine dried to a map, a fork embedded where someone mistook oak for mercy, a lace cuff gone brown where a hand had gripped too late. Sheriff Pike arrived with the careful step of a man who has seen all the wrong things and knows there are always new wrong things. He took in the room without touching what would contaminate him. He asked no questions at first. He looked for the kitchen. That is where his questions lived. The scullery smelled of soap that had tried its best and lost. On the table, the folded note waited like a trap that had no interest in catching anything but truth. Pike read it once, then again, lips moving without sound. He slid it into his pocket the way you tuck a live thing into a coat to keep it from dying of exposure. Rosalind lay on a fainting couch that had finally earned its name. The colonel sat upright in a chair someone had dragged where it didn't belong and looked 10 years into a future he would not have the muscle to lift. He said the word sabotage the way a man says weather. The Reverend hovered, small now, his voice reduced to a draft under a door. "Where is she?" Pike asked Samuel, because he was the only man in the yard whose hands had honest soot on them. "Gone," Samuel said, the way a man says breathing when a baby finally remembers how. He did not look at the sheriff. He looked at the patch of sky framed between kitchen roof and smokehouse eave, and measured how far a body can get if it understands the geometry of not being seen. Upstairs, 3 children slept the stubborn sleep of those who miss the worst. Their breath made small clouds against cold air. A girl stirred, murmured a word that could have been sugar or mother or more. Pike sent a rider for a doctor who owed him no favors, and another for a judge who at least knew how to read the parts of a thing that aren't written on paper. He walked the perimeter of the house, eyes low, looking not for footprints. There were 100, but for choices. He found one at the cotton shed where the earth had been disturbed with the care of a woman who knows how to cover fire so it looks like sleep. The river looked back at him without comment. He looked down at his boots and thought about all the times he had taken the ferry and never once asked what else the island knew. Celia did not take the road. Roads belonged to men who put their names on maps. She took what the river offered and what the swamp tolerated. Runnels that think they are creeks, paths that remember deer and forget people, the chalky backs of ridges that hold their breath when weight passes. She moved by sounds you can only hear if you've taught your heart to shut up. Crabs murmuring in mud, the sleep talk of owls, the soft arithmetic of paddles dipping and not dipping. She carried nothing that clinked. Weight is an argument you lose when a night decides to test you. At first light she folded herself into a hollow where a cypress root made a pew. She slept with one hand tucked under her cheek and the other on the small knife she'd used for string and pie twine and stubborn corks. When she woke, the river had left a gift, a drift of reeds braided by accident into a mat for her knees. She laughed once, quietly, because you have to keep your mouth in practice for when you need it for survival and not for sorrow. She avoided lanterns the way a widow avoids music. A skiff passed with 2 men arguing softly over whose cousin had married worse, and she learned from their voices that Sheriff Pike had found a letter and that the colonel had looked hollowed. One man swore he'd eat only bread and water until Lent forgave him ahead of schedule. The other said bread and water can be seasoned too. Celia's mind kept 2 ledgers, one for the world's movements, one for memory. The first kept her alive. The second kept her going. Thomas's laugh. Mary's hair always escaping its ribbon. Eli's sticky fingers offered as a gift. She did not speak their names. She tasted them, sweetness folded into grit. A hunter's hut stood where no map admitted it. Inside, a tin cup, a coil of line, a coat that remembered a man's shape. Celia took nothing but a pinch of salt and left 2 coins wrapped in cloth. Not from honesty, from mathematics. She had a long sum to solve and could not afford the interest on thieving. By the second night she had learned the pattern of dogs, where they were and when they slept, the pattern of men, where they believed they were owed, and the pattern of stars, how to ask them a question without looking like you were asking for favor. She crossed a boundary none of the planters visited unless they were lost and too proud to admit it. The air changed. The ground forgave. She breathed easier, not because she was safe, but because she had left behind a sound she would not miss, the house exhaling after supper. Back at Riverbend, the narrative was being repaired. It always is. Men whose job it is to translate guilt into paperwork began to practice their cursive. The colonel spoke with a voice that insisted upon normalcy and broke over certain vowels. He told Sheriff Pike that Celia had always been high-strung and that grief makes women miscalculate. He asked whether the paper would be kind. The paper is not kind. It is exact. Asher had not found a grave to practice being decent in. The doctor, one from Natchez with clean fingernails and a faith in Latin, wrote things on his pad that kept him from admitting he did not know what he was looking at. He used the word mysterious when earned would have done. Pike found the little book in Celia's cabin, the flour sack stitched into a cover, the pages lead with grease and steam and delicate, steady lines. Recipes. Yes. Also inventories. Also small sentences that looked for all the world like prayers until you read them aloud and discovered they were plans. He closed it and kept it, not as evidence yet, as a mirror. He did not show it to the colonel. News crawled. It bites harder when it crawls. In the county seats, men stirred coffee and swore their tables were safe because their cooks were loyal, because loyalty is a thing you can purchase along with peaches. Women wrote letters to sisters and slid euphemisms between the lines like mothballs. The Reverend's hand shook at the pulpit. He preached about forgiveness and the danger of women reading. He did not mention the 3 children who slept through terror because a mother protected what she did not intend to injure. The choir held the long notes like they could outlast the week. Samuel kept his forge hot and his mouth closed. That worried men more than shouting would have. A quiet man is a locked door. The colonel sent someone with a folded sum and a folded threat. Samuel nodded slowly until both folded things looked like paper again, and then went back to telling Metal what to become. Sheriff Pike hired boats, walked the island, counted pits that said the house did not only cook meals for its guests. He found lime where lime does its unambiguous work. He found hooks where men insist hooks are only tools. He took off his hat and stood in the ruin of the smokehouse and let the river smell him thinking. Distance teaches a story to grow legs. By the time Riverbend's guest list reached Vicksburg, the wedding had become a masquerade and the feast had included wine that moved by itself. In New Orleans, a paper printed the word witch because it sells better than woman who learned what the world refused to teach her. Somewhere in Charleston, a matron told her kitchen to boil water for every jar and label every smile. Planters did not stop eating. They stopped tasting. They hired tasters like kings, and tasters learned quickly that certain salaries require a philosophy. Men blessed their plates and then watched their wives swallow first and called it chivalry. Women taught themselves how to survive polite hunger. Children began to ask whether their mothers were brave or cruel for letting them sleep through the bad parts. Cooks were suddenly seen. Not respected, seen. The way you look hard at a knife before you pick it up. Some were dismissed because fear is clumsy. Some were locked into loyalty with promises that tasted like bribes. Some made eye contact with other cooks over church steps and passed a look that said, "Learn to write where no one thinks to look." Abolitionists in parlors up north took the story and dressed it in morals that fit their wardrobes. They missed the kitchen heat and the river smell and the math. They missed Celia's hand steady on a ladle while the world tripped over its shoes. But they spoke her new name, and names carry. Sheriff Pike read at night by lamplight and let the words put splinters under his manners. He thought about law as a set of shelves and wondered how many jars could be set on them before the whole thing fell. He wrote to a judge he trusted and used phrases like pattern and premeditation, and then added one more, provocation, because truth requires more words than verdicts do. The colonel tried to sell Riverbend to a cousin who had already learned how to run a place that didn't love him back. The cousin came, stood in the dining room, smelled the air that would not be fresh again for 100 Sundays, and declined with courtesy. The house heard and sulked. The river is not a road, but it has destinations. Low towns that sleep by its pulse. places where a woman can find a day's work if her hands speak dialects of heat and patience. Celia traded her bonnet for a plain hat and her apron for another apron. She learned the geometry of new kitchens quickly. Ovens are older than dialect. Fire doesn't care your name as long as you feed it respectfully. In a town that did not insist on asking questions at first light, a widow with careful eyes let Celia sleep under her roof in exchange for 3 loaves that remembered to rise and a jar of pickled okra that could make a meal forgive itself for being small. Celia said her name softly and then slower, Miss Washington. The widow nodded like a woman who recognizes an adoption when she hears one. Rumors have their own ferries. Some said they saw Celia on a packet boat headed north, a shawl over her shoulders and a Bible in her lap open to pages that promised new names. Others swore she vanished into the same swamp that had trained her and became one of those necessary legends you keep in a county so children learn which paths are polite to avoid. At night, Celia wrote on the backs of old bills and wrapping paper, lists that could be mistaken for groceries until you looked close, reminders to teach, not to cook, how to hold a knife without fear, how to say no without letting the word look scared, how to tell which men believe hunger excuses everything. She folded the papers into a tin and buried them below a root that remembers the names of storms. She did not send word to Samuel. She sent him a silence he could wear without being punished for knowing too much. In her mouth, she kept 3 names sweet and did not share them with anyone's God. Time puts distance on even the loudest rooms. Riverbend learned to rot politely. The porch sagged like a tired courtesy. The smokehouse lost its roof to a storm that did not intend symbolism and achieved it anyway. The split in the family found a way to masquerade as real estate. Sheriff Pike aged into the kind of man boys don't bother to test. He kept the flour sack book in a drawer under his shirts, not because it belonged to him, but because there was nowhere else to put something that looked like a recipe and read like a map to a particular kind of courage. On bad nights he took it out and stared at the pages until the letters blurred into a sound that was not quite music. Rosalind faded in a genteel way. Handkerchiefs and shades drawn, and a physician who believed in clean sheets more than he believed in repentance. The Reverend practiced shorter homilies and longer silences, like a man expecting interruption. Ash's name became a cautionary tale polite mothers did not enjoy telling. The Colonel died upright in a chair with his boots on and his regrets arranged where no one had to trip over them. Samuel worked until the war taught iron new prayers. He mended tools for men who did not say thank you and occasionally for men who did. He went to the small gravestones when the fields thinned and left bread on the earth, the way you leave a visitor a plate on the table, even after the guest has learned to stop knocking. Children who had slept through the wedding night grew tall and asked questions polite people hoped would not be fashionable. Some of them learned to read. Some of them moved to cities where kitchens had windows and orders came on tickets and anger found different uniforms. A few came back and stood at the river and didn't flinch. The house stood empty long enough to become a ruin, and then a quarry, and then a field where nothing quite wanted to grow. In winter, when the wind came from the right direction, it carried across the flat an odor like old sugar burned and arguments never finished. Years turned like a slow wheel. People who had sworn oaths forgot their exact wording but remembered the way their mouths felt making them. The county learned to tell the story with the edges sanded for company and the teeth kept for private. Some nights, when the river is up and the frogs decide to sing over their pay grade, a light shows in the place where the kitchen used to breathe. Folk say that's foolishness, the eye making a picture because it gets bored of darkness. Then a wind shift brings a smell, vanilla, milk warmed low, the small mercy of a lullaby, and even fools choose to be quiet for a minute. Did Celia cross into states where papers couldn't find her? Did she buy a little yard with a pear tree that took too long to learn how to be generous? Did she teach a girl to cook and a boy to mend and a room full of women how to spell their names in ash? Or did the river take her back the way it takes everything if you sit still long enough? We don't get that page. We get the part where a woman took the only power the house let her hold and turned it so it faced the house. We get the math, a wedding of 17, a kitchen of 1, the ledger balanced not in comfort but in clarity. If you felt a shiver, It isn't the ghost of Riverbend. It's the thought that nothing supernatural happened here. No hex, no curse, just skill, patience, and the refusal to keep swallowing a world that insists you deserve to be hungry. That's the scariest thing we tell on this channel. The ordinary tools of a kitchen rearranged the fate of a county, and the recipe was simply attention paid too long. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. If this is your first time with us, subscribe, because the next cases are waiting in ledgers and attics and quiet rooms that believe they were safe. Leave a like if you want more long-form deep dives into the Macabre Corner's official history keeps forgetting to dust. And answer me this: was Celia's act justice or revenge, or the only language a house like Riverbend could understand? Reality is colder than fiction. Don't miss the next story. We are just getting to the darkest rooms.